So let's read what the scripture itself says about Jesus, because maybe some people don't believe me and they think we can just go to Paul and get doctrines from him while ignoring Jesus Christ, which is where Paul got his doctrines from. But if you don't believe me, then I'll show you that the scripture itself says that. And as a side note, if you're going to ignore Jesus and his parables and the things he said, and just go get doctrines from one of the apostles, why not get them from John or Peter or James or Jude? Why not get them from other places? Why does it always have to be Paul? And why only certain places in Paul's writings, certain of his books? Because we don't get doctrines from the 1st and 2nd Timothy that I know of. There's a lot in there that the church doesn't obey. We only get them from some select parts of Romans, Ephesians, and Galatians, pretty much. And it's only parts of those books. And it just happens to be the parts where Paul's talking about grace versus works. And if we ignore all the rest of the things Paul said, and the things that the other apostles said, and the things that Jesus said, we can take those little passages out of those books we've chosen and make up doctrines that make it look like God doesn't expect anything from us. And it's very convenient and very attractive if you want to get money put into your offering plates and get followers and get your pews filled at your church. However, Jesus himself, as well as Moses back in the book of Deuteronomy, and Paul himself, all say the same thing, and they say that Jesus' own words are the foundation of our belief system. If we call ourselves Christians, we're supposed to be following Jesus, right? So we'll go to Deuteronomy chapter 18, 15 through 19, and Moses himself is prophesying about Jesus coming. Moses himself is saying that God's going to raise up a prophet like himself. And that can only be Jesus, because Jesus is the only person that ever came that did something similar to what Moses did. Moses was the founder of Moses' law, of the Torah. Jesus was the founder of Christianity. So none of the other people that came after the time of Moses that wrote anything in the Bible or said anything or did anything ever came anywhere near Moses' status, except for Jesus. So reading Deuteronomy 18, 15 through 19, we see that Moses puts Jesus above himself. Then we can see what Paul says. And then we're going to go see what Jesus said. So we saw what Moses said in Deuteronomy 18. Now we'll skip over Jesus first and see what Paul himself said. And he said something in a couple places. And he said the exact same thing that Moses had said 1,400 years earlier. In Hebrews 3, 1 through 6, Paul clearly states the same thing that Moses did, that Jesus has more authority than Moses. Then we can go to 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 4 through 15, and see that Paul states that Jesus had more authority than himself. Then we'll go to Matthew chapter 7, 21 through 28, the parable of the house built on the rock versus the house built on the sand, and we'll see that Jesus gives himself more authority than Moses or than Paul or than anyone else. Jesus also said, I am the way and the truth and the life. Paul said, follow me as I follow Jesus. So if we wanted to, we could search the Bible all day long. No matter where we look, we're going to find that Jesus is the foundation, and all other biblical writers are built on top of Jesus, whether they wrote before Jesus was alive or after Jesus was alive. Every one of them admit to the same thing, and then Jesus himself admits to the same thing. Jesus himself puts himself in a higher position of authority than anyone else who ever wrote in the Bible. So knowing that, how could you logically go to any part of the Bible and create a doctrine solely based on some passage you find in there without backing it up against what Jesus said? All of Scripture has to be backed up against the rest of Scripture. You can't take any part of the Bible and build some doctrine. I mean, you wouldn't even take something Jesus said on its own and make a doctrine without consulting the rest of Scripture. how much less can you take another part of the Bible and make a doctrine out of it without consulting the rest of Scripture? So in Matthew 7, in Hebrews 3, in 1 Corinthians 3, and all the way back in Deuteronomy 18, we have passages that confirm all doctrine needs to be built on the foundation of the words in red, of Jesus' words. And any doctrine that's made up by using any other scripture without consulting Jesus' own words is going to be off base, especially if it's done intentionally.